Hello and welcome. It's a forgotten war to many. Somalia is such a tangle of political and military interests that it's hard to know the good guys from the bad guys. From Ethiopian troops backing the transitional federal government to the splintering Islamic groups fighting a guerrilla war against them, it's the civilians who are caught in the middle, starving and dying. Norway has just hosted a meeting of the International Contact Group for Somalia to discuss the political process, the security situation, and desperate humanitarian conditions which have been shaped by 17 years of chaos and civil war. But as politicians meet in Europe, the people of Somalia continue to be caught in the crossfire. Last week, a raid on the Al-Hidya mosque left 21 people dead, including the imam. Amnesty International accused Ethiopian troops of extrajudicial killings during a weekend of heavy fighting between Ethiopian troops and Islamist insurgents. Amnesty said 41 children arrested in the raid were being detained at an Ethiopian military base in the Somali capital. Ethiopia denied the charges of executions and says the children will be released once they've been investigated. The US State Department has remained silent in the middle of all this. Now, don't forget, we take your calls on the show. You can reach us at the numbers at the bottom of your screen. And today the question we're asking is, what can the international community do to improve the situation in Somalia? Joining the discussion on this volatile region of the Horn of Africa is Jeffrey Gettleman, the East Africa Bureau Chief of the New York Times, who's been based in Nairobi, Kenya since 2006. He's written extensively on the crisis in Somalia. Joining me here in Washington, D.C. is John Prendergast, the co-chair of the Enough Project, founded in 2007 to find sustainable solutions for ongoing crises in Africa. He's also a well-known human rights activist who's advised the U.S. government extensively on African conflicts. I welcome you to the program, gentlemen. And John, I'd like to start with you and ask about the window of opportunity that you've been writing about recently, saying that this window might prevent Somalia from sliding into further heavy conflict and also perhaps avert some of that humanitarian crisis I mentioned.
Yeah. Well, for quite some time now, since the intervention by Ethiopia into Somalia, which displaced the Islamist authority that had taken hold, finally created a government in Somalia. Since that time, the Ethiopian-backed transitional federal government you spoke about in the introduction hasn't really reached out to elements from within the Islamist community and some of the clans that have been disaffected through this political and military process. For the first time, a serious olive branch was extended by the new prime minister of this transitional federal government there in Mogadishu. And so it's an opportunity. You know, there's still certainly tremendous divisions within that transitional federal government between a faction that headed by the prime minister and a faction headed by the president who's much closer to the Ethiopian government. But it's an opening nonetheless, and we need to take advantage of that.
Now, how much for that window of opportunity to succeed is it going to depend on support from the international community, much of which the US in particular, as you often note, has turned its back on Somalia since the early 90s or mid-90s?
Yeah, the US sure has, and you know, it's for a variety of reasons, and we just have to re-engage because there is this chance. And I think that it requires getting a number of actors. The region is full of countries who have, at one point or another, just like the United States, used Somalia or used factions within Somalia for political purposes. And the time has come now to bring the Ethiopians and other countries who have significant interests and significant leverage within Somalia to a broader process that looks for a way to get beyond this horrific fighting that's going on in Somalia today.
Let's bring in Jeffrey Gettleman here from Nairobi, who's joining us. We'll actually bring him in just a second and ask him a little bit about that. Actually, let me get an email to you here that came in from Calgary in Canada. And Hassan Mohammed says, 3 years ago, Ethiopian Prime Minister Meles said they would not allow Somalia to become a threat to the region again. The solution is to let Somalis sort out their problems and leave them alone. There is no solution for Somalia until Ethiopia withdraws from the country. Now, considering Ethiopia's interest in the country and security fears, what chance is there of that?
You know, it's like saying, you know, until the U.S. leaves Iraq, there will be no solution. We'd like that. Certainly, it would be better if that happened. But there are political imperatives on the part of the interveners, in this case Ethiopia, that will prevent them from precipitously withdrawing. Ideally, we want to negotiate a timetable to get the Ethiopians out. But they have interests. And the interest there is that they fear genuinely that a strong government in Somalia, no matter who it is, will look to bring together all of the Somali populations in the region and attempt to annex the eastern part of Ethiopia, which is almost 100% Somali. So they have that legitimate security threat. That doesn't justify their invading Somalia. That doesn't justify the horrible crimes against humanity that they've committed in the context of this intervention. But we have to understand there's a security interest. That's why negotiations are so important.
Now, quickly, before I get to a caller, could Ethiopia have taken that move without the U.S. backing at the time?
The U.S. backing gave them a political cover that allowed them to conduct an intervention across another border, and at a time when sovereignty remains the order of the world, and I think it also provided some critical intelligence that allowed them to win militarily more quickly, at least gain control of Mogadishu. They've since, just like in the U.S. and Iraq, lost a lot of what they gained at the beginning because of this very large and growing insurgency within Somalia. But U.S. support, particularly politically support, was very, very important for Ethiopia.
Well, let's get a caller in from Arizona. Assad's on the line. Assad, what would you like to ask?
Yes, please. In my opinion, we could solve, if we are Somalian people, that problem if the Ethiopian troops get out of Somalia.
Sorry, Assad, I lost the last bit of what you said there. Could you repeat that last bit of the question?
The last word will be the Ethiopian troops should be out of Somalia.
Right.
That's the only solution we could make, settlement for that fighting.
Let me put this to Jeffrey Gettleman, who's joining us from Nairobi, who's the East Africa bureau chief of the New York Times. Jeffrey, great to have you. And let's put that to you. Our caller said basically nothing can happen unless Ethiopia leaves Somalia. I ask you to answer that, but also ask you, how do you see this window of opportunity, which I was just discussing with John Prendergast about the chance for the Prime Minister now of the transitional federal government reaching out and perhaps actually achieving some success in bringing people together?
Well, I think there's no doubt that most Somalis want the Ethiopians to leave. However, if they did, there would be an enormous security vacuum, and most likely the transitional federal government would not be able to survive in Mogadishu. If that's what people want, that's what would happen if the Ethiopians left. Now, as far as this window of opportunity, there is an enormous diplomatic initiative happening right now here in Nairobi to try to work out some sort of peace deal between the Islamists and the TFG, the Transitional Federal Government of Somalia. But it just doesn't look like it's really materializing into much on the ground. The fighting is only increasing. More and more civilians are getting killed. We've heard increasing reports about atrocities committed by all sides. So right now it actually looks pretty pessimistic and gloomy that any type of peace scenario is going to emerge anytime soon.
And Jeffrey, you broke the story about the killings in the Ogaden region. I wonder, when taking that into account, and also the killings at the mosque, the Al-Hidya mosque, and so on, it's been surprising to a lot of people. There's been no international outcry over this, particularly no condemnation from the USA. When you consider that what's been going on.
Well, what's happening in the USA is there's a debate within the government itself about what to do about Ethiopia. The Bush administration, and especially the military, like working with Ethiopia. They see it as its best bet in the volatile Horn of Africa. However, there's an increasing number of members of Congress, some senators and congressmen together on both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats, that are increasingly critical about Ethiopia's human rights policy. And last summer, there was legislation passed that would put restrictions on aid to Ethiopia. Right now, it receives $500 million of annual aid from the United States each year. And there are members of Congress who want to restrict that because they're very upset about what's happening in the Ogaden and in Somalia regarding human rights.
A quick thought from you, Jeffrey, on the humanitarian crisis and how much attention is being paid on the ground there to how desperate the situation's become.
Well, a lot of people say it's shaping up into another scenario that we saw in 1991 and 1992, where you have this combination of war, displacement, drought, and internal instability, and that blocks aid food from coming into the country. More and more people need it. The farming areas are not productive because the conflict has displaced people. And right now we're seeing those same elements line up. My theory is that food will still be able to get into Somalia. They're able to bring a lot of food in by ship. That used to be a problem, but the piracy issue has been taken care of to some extent regarding UN food, because the French, the Dutch, and the Danish have been guarding food shipments by ship to come into Somalia. So right now we're on the precipice of a serious humanitarian disaster, but it's not clear yet if it has actually materialized.
John, one of the things that a lot of people ask is why isn't Africa taking care of Africa, so to speak? I mean, the African Union mission in Somalia was set up. There's not a large number of AU forces in Somalia, and it seems their mission isn't really much to do with protecting the people.
There's two problems with that. First one is that truth is the only entity that has responded in any significant way to the crisis on the ground in Somalia have been African forces. It's a small, just like in Darfur, for 4 years, the world sort of hoped that if the African Union could perhaps take care of the problem, we could move on to the next thing. Didn't work out. But certainly the African Union has been the first responder. It's been a weak response, but principally that leads into the second problem. You can't keep a peace, the troops that are sent in there can't keep a peace that hasn't been negotiated. And that's where Jeffrey's point comes in, is that this massive effort, this international effort to address the terrible crisis, the political crisis